You're right, folks, and welcome back. Now, you've probably seen the title for the video, and I'm sure a lot of you have just gone, why bother? Well, I thought much the same as you. However, as Cata approaches, more people in-game are talking about the expansion, and this subject has actually come up quite a bit from what I've seen, be it people in my guild just nattering in raids, or trade chat nonsense, or even the inciting incident for me making this video. So, if like me you've played WoW for far too long, you probably remember which races get which classes in this expansion and yada yada, and I thought that was fairly common knowledge, and to a degree I suppose it is. But if you started playing WoW in Classic, or even way after Cataclysm, you may not know that these additions are coming, and then you've got others who are just confusing matters slightly. Hence the incident that I just mentioned. So some context, I was doing a daily dungeon on my priest and ended up with an abnormally chatty group. It was actually quite nice, everyone was having a natter, and the subject of Cataclysm came up, and one fella mentioned he was going to race change his priest to a gnome. This then led someone to saying they might do the same for their hunter. Now, that's not exactly possible because that's not a Cataclysm feature. Gnomes in retail did get access to the hunter class eventually, but not until Legion. However, this bloke could not be convinced otherwise. He might have been trolling, but the conviction in his statements was undeniable, and I think that if the run went on any longer, he might have actually sworn on the grave of his own mother that gnomes do in fact get hunters in Cataclysm. As such, it became very apparent to me that not everyone actually is that up to snuff on the race class combo changes in Cata, be it due to never having actually played the expansion, or simply being confused with additions that came later on in WoW's life. Because of that, I thought sod it, let's go over the race class combo updates for Cataclysm. So let's start with the Horde, because why not? And up top we have the Orcs. In this expansion they get exactly one new class to run around as, the Mage. So yeah, the big greens can now be wizards. I don't really think there was ever any great reason as to why they couldn't be. A theme you will see throughout this video is that in most cases if a race can be a warlock, they can in theory be a mage as well, or vice versa. I think the only exceptions to this rule in Cata are Draenei and Night Elves, which kinda makes sense because the versions of those races that dabble in fell magics we tend to perceive as evildoers and exterminate them with extreme prejudice. I mean, lore-wise, it kinda makes sense. They're teamed up with trolls, undead, and blood elves, all of which value magic pretty highly, so wizard orcs is a fairly top-shelf idea, and since they can be warlocks, as I said, it's not the biggest leap in logic. Onto the Undead. They are another race with only a single addition, this time the Hunter. Now, we'll see this with Human later, but it was one of those classes that always felt like it should have been in their toolkit from the get-go. Obviously, Hunters have this whole connection to nature malarkey going on with regards to their animals, but the Hunter class in WoW has always had more to it than simply, I have a bear! They can quite literally just be a huntsman, survivalists, people just proficient with a gun. Those sort of skills don't necessarily require you to be buddy-buddy with the local spiders, though in the case of the Undeads, that is certainly true as well. The Tauren next, and they get two new classes, the Priest and the Paladin. Long story short, in lore, there is a group of Tauren called the Sunwalkers, and they worship the sun and basically draw their power from it. It's the same sort of mechanism as your holy light cathedral-dwelling humans and dwarves, and actually it's closer to Night Elves. It's just a different battery powering them, as it were, and it's similar to how trolls and, again, Night Elves can be priests in-game, but they aren't holy light aficionados unlike dwarves and humans, yet they all have the same abilities and whatnot. They're priests, but not in the same sense as we might understand it from a gameplay perspective. But with that being said, don't expect your spells like Holy Shock to be replaced with Severe Sunburn for Taurens, even though that's kind of what it is. What this does mean, however, is that Taurens are the first and only class in Cata to have access to all available healing classes, which is something I've always rather enjoyed as a mental image. I'm a big fan of Tauren, and the sight of your raid's back line being mostly comprised of dress-wearing giant cowmen amuses me to no end. Trolls also get two new classes, the Warlock and the Druid. Both make a fair amount of sense in the context of the Troll race. The Warlock thing is much like I said for the Orc Mage. Trolls already have spellcasters in their ranks. It stands to reason a few of them might dabble in magics beyond the arcane. Where Druid is concerned, yeah, again, it's not a massive leap in logic. They worship the Lower, which is basically another word for wild god, and much like the elves and Taurens, a Lower or two bestowing its power and form on those who worship them and the wilds in general is pretty par for the course. As far as playable trolls go, they were basically recruited by the Raptor Lower Gonk to stop Zalazlane from completely annihilating the wildlife on the Echo Isles. There is a little bit more to it than that, but that is the gist. Due to these additions, trolls can be every playable class in Cata, save the Paladin, though this is something that trolls would technically get later on in the game's life with the introduction of the Zandalari. Not quite the same type of troll, but a troll paladin nevertheless. Then there are Blood Elves with the most obvious addition yet, Warrior. It never made any sense to me as to why Blood Elves couldn't be warriors. I mean, it is the most basic class in RPG history. Give a dude a pointy stick and have him hit things with it. I think the idea in TVC was that Blood Elves have paladins, so they don't need to be warriors. But again, it never really made any sense. You see Blood Elf NPCs being warriors, so yeah, it was just weird. They fixed that in Cata, so you can go around swinging two big-ass swords on your Legolas clone, should you choose. The final Horde race in Cataclysm is Goblin. Since this is the new addition to the faction, everything here is technically new. So they can be Warrior, Hunter, Rogue, Priest, DK, Shaman, Mage, and Warlock. Again, the change here is that Goblins are now playable, so go have fun with that. Onto the Alliance then. Starting with Human, they, like the Undead, only get a single new addition, and it is that of the Hunter. And as I said, with the Undead, it's one of those combos that was always rather conspicuous in its absence. Why couldn't a human pick up a bow and go make friends with a local wolf? If dwarves can do it, I'm fairly certain humans could do it as well. In Cata, they've finally worked it out, so if the idea of being Hawkeye or Green Arrow appeals to you, knock yourself out. Dwarves, they get the highest number of additions out of any race in Cataclysm, and much like the Trolls, this leaves them in a position where they can play all but one class. In this instance, that's the Druid. So, the new additions to Dwarves include the Shaman, Mage, and Warlock classes. Again, I go back to the Mage Warlock thing that I said earlier. Generally, if you can be one, there's no real reason why you shouldn't be able to be the other. But the thing with dwarves is, very early on, they were actually intended to be mages, and its removal was fairly last minute. In some of the earliest prints of the game manual, it's actually listed that dwarves could in fact be a mage. Its removal might have been down to faction balancing somewhat, as the Horde only had access to two races who could be mages in vanilla, but who knows. As for Shaman and Warlock, there are reasons aplenty in lore as to both, but the Wild Hammer and Dark Irons play much bigger roles in Dwarven society this expansion, and long after in fact. And the Wild Hammer are thematically mad griffin riding enhancement shamans, and Dark Irons are very clearly into the darker side of magic, so it just makes sense that those things would funnel down to the average player dwarf as well. Night Elves next, and they only have one new class in Cata, and that is the Mage. This is actually one of those additions that has a degree of serious lore behind it. If you know anything about Night Elves, their history is just steeped in arcane magic. Just look at Jara, the Highborn, and the mess of the War of the Ancients. During Wrath, one such Highborn could actually be found in Darnassus, Morden Evenshade, and he's an NPC who most wouldn't really notice, but he is basically the catalyst for playable Night Elf mages. Because of their, shall we say, checkered history with the arcane, Night Elves just kinda swore it off for a while, well at least most did. But the Chendralar of Dire Maul fame are actually a society of Night Elf mages, and after talking with Tyrande, Morden is able to have them rejoin wider Night Elf society. So you got that guy to thank for playable Night Elf wizards. Next for the boys in blue, the Gnomes. As I mentioned at the start of the video, Gnome Priests are a thing. This is the only addition for the Gnome race in Cataclysm, and is in fact their first healing class. Up to now, gnomes could only be tanks or DPS, which, like I said with the Tauren, amuses me greatly. I love the fact that before this, a gnome would technically be more comfortable stood at the foot of a world-eating dragon, clad in heavy plate with a massive shield, screaming at the top of its teeny tiny lungs, instead of somewhere near the back, keeping his more physically imposing companions alive. I genuinely believe that this is the only reason gnomes were given this class, because they were actually the only race in game who couldn't be a healer. Gnomes always had medics and whatnot, every race does, so they just took that idea and said, sod it, you're a priest now. Which, fair enough. Then there's the Draenei. Sadly, this is the only pre-existing race that does not receive any new additions. What classes they could be before, they can be now. In fact, apart from the monk added in Mists of Pandaria, Draenei don't actually see any sort of additions to their possible combinations until Dragonflight. So we finish with the Worgen. Like the Goblin, this is the new race, but for Alliance, so it's all technically new. They can be warriors, hunters, rogues, priests, DKs, mages, warlocks, and druids. So if you want to play a Worgen of any of those classes, have fun. And that's everything. Hope you enjoyed, and if you were a bit confused as to what races get what classes in Cata, hopefully you're not now. Let me know your own thoughts down below. Be so kind as to like, sub, share your pals, and so on. That'll be grand. Have a good one, folks. Bye for now.